Now, today is part 2. So going back to last time, we ended off, we were doing the hunt, and we moved laterally through those laterally through the hunts. We moved progressively through the hunts where we first looked for leveraging some threat intel, and we looked for specific indicators of activity. And we kind of stopped when we wanted to start pivoting to find out which devices in this particular example an nefarious actor actually got onto. So we will pick up the hunting from that point, and I'll provide a little bit of a review there before we jump into it. Okay, we're going to start today, however, we'll just do a very quick review, again, of those attack components, the anatomy of the attack, and the threat hunting process. I'm going to go through that very quickly because, of course, we covered it last time. And if you weren't able to attend all the webinar, maybe you jumped in late, again, go to our YouTube channel. You can find the webinar there where we spend quite a bit more time there. And then we're going to go into continuing the hunt. So we do need to move from where we saw those login events and we saw that Azure Hound activity, and we need to move now and identify which devices were effectively logged onto, and then review that threat intel to look for those next indicators of activity that we want to continue that hunt for. So we have about 3 hunts left that we want to actually run through. We're then going to switch over and start talking about some of the things you can do to automate that hunting process. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about how you can very quickly create custom detection rules in Defender or analytic rules in Sentinel, all from the same platform. We're going to talk about Sentinel hunts, so a way of storing hunts and being able to run them on an automatic basis, or on an automatic basis, I should say. And then we're going to focus on leveraging a Sentinel playbook to fully automate a hunt. And so I'll walk through how that playbook is built. And it's just an example. And then we'll actually run it so you can see it kind of working live in action. Okay. So let's again talk about the anatomy of attack and the attack components. And again, just really want to highlight, it is always about the data, either confidentiality, availability, or integrity. That's what the attackers are going after, is your data. They either want to prevent your access to it, or they want to steal it, or they want to destroy it. Maybe they want to hold it for ransom, right? So within the context of any investigation, we always do need to understand the data that they're going after. Okay, and when you see these hunts, we're trying to figure out if an attacker's in our environment. So and then in such a way that it would necessitate now launching an investigation. So of course, within the hunting that we're doing, we're not going to get right down to the data that was accessed. If you want to see what that might look like, there's a couple of other webinars that we did last year, again, on our YouTube site, where we actually get right down to the details behind how to do an investigation in Defender. You got to kind of go deep, right down to data that was accessed. So you can always, if you want to see how that looks, you can certainly use our other webinars to show you that there. Now, in the context, again, of those attack components, and this is our simplified version. You heard Brian last time talk about, this is sort of like a summarized version, if you would, of the Lockheed Martin attack kill chain. Really, these are the things that you want to take notice of, to identify. Within the Defender platform, they're referred to as entities. Okay, these are the items that you want to track as you're doing an investigation and as you're doing a hunt. And as you saw last time, many of these sorry, I just noticed there's something happened to the Renee, sorry, or Mitch, can you confirm you can still see my screen?
Yeah, you're still.
Okay, sorry. On my side here, things cut out. I do apologize for that, guys. So these are the items that you want to track while you're doing an investigation or a hunt. And as you saw last time, a lot of these components, whether that's the vector or the endpoint or the identity or the privilege, are actually used as inputs into successive hunts. So again, we want to make sure that we're maintaining and tracking them as we go along, particularly we're hunting. And I'm going to show you a way of doing that when we get into the automated side of things, specifically with the custom detection rules and the Sentinel hunts. Now, again, this is just a very quick overview of a type of attack that's seen. This is Sandworm, if you remember back from last time. I'm showing all the steps kind of right up at the get-go and the things that have been tracked kind of as we've walked through this particular attack, or this this particular investigation. So in the context of an investigation, but it is the same as a hunt, you want to start tracking these components so that you can, again, use them for successive hunts, map them and identifying, and if necessary, when you launch an investigation off of a hunt, be able to do sort of like a quick remediation. Okay. Again, let's very quickly take a look at the threat hunting process. Gather intelligence, formulate hypothesis. Those are interchangeable in terms of when they happen. Often you're going to have this idea and that's going to trigger you to go, I need to figure out how this is going to unfold. And that would be the intelligence gathering side of things. But sometimes it's actually going to be like an intelligence report, which we showed last time, where you're going to get a notification of a report, and that's going to trigger you to go in, do that research, and then formulate that hypothesis and look for those types of tactics, techniques, all that sort of fun stuff in order to start launching your hunt. And again, from there, you're going to identify those tactics, techniques, procedures, those indicators of activity. What is it that we're looking for? And again, when we're talking about hunting, usually a single query or a single hunt that brings back activity is not itself indicative of malicious activity. It can be, but often it's the chain series of events that we want to look for. So hunting is not a single query. It is a sequential process, or sometimes even a parallel process where you're running multiple hunts trying to chain these activities together to really bubble up malicious activity within your environment. And again, after you've identified what those IOAs are, those TTPs, now we need to actually do the hunt. So how are we going to structure that hunt, and where are we going to do that hunt? And of course, in the case of Sentinel and Defender, that's done right in that platform. There will be times in your security journey where a hunt may take you outside of these platforms. You might need to look at some things that maybe aren't available within the platform, like physical access controls, for example. But most of the hunting will be done within the platform. Of course, for today, that's where we will continue to do our hunting. And then last but not least, if you found these chained activities that are really indicative of some malicious activity, how do we remediate and respond? Like, how do we investigate? What are the options, the things that we can do to prevent this from happening in the future? Or at least to contain that threat, and what are some of the lessons learned, maybe in terms of improving the threat hunting process or improving our detection rules. And that will tie in a little bit more when we start talking about some of the automation with custom detection rules and log analytic rules within Sentinel. Okay, again, I wanted to run through that really quickly. So now we're going to go back to that threat hunting process. Okay, and so I'm just going to bring this back up. This is the attack path, if you would, that we reviewed last time in that threat intel report that's available in Threat Analytics. Again, this is the Peach Sandstorm password sprays activity profile. That's the threat report that this came from. Taking a snapshot of this image for you again, so that we can just very quickly walk through it and review kind of what we did last time, right? So last time, the first thing we looked for is, when we only looked at the path one, is we wanted to look for that initial access, right? So we looked for those password sprays, right? And we saw, when we did that very quick query, we saw indications of a number of password spray attacks, but not just password spray attacks that were blocked, really blocked logins that were followed by successful logins. We leveraged that particular password spray attack to do another query. We ran that query, if you recall, against the sign-in logs and the Azure AD non-interactive logs. So we joined those tables together to take a look to see, okay, do we have any indications within our environment of actual successful logins? So not just a password spray where we're seeing a validation of credentials, but an actual logon. We then went back to this report, looked at the next step in that chain of events that we should be looking for. Here it calls out Azure Hound as the recon activity. So we went back to our hunt. We extended that hunt, leveraging some of those attack components, some of those entities, specifically IP address and account, an account that was compromised, to look for Azure Hound activity. And lo and behold, we found some. Where we left off last webinar is we had all the information that showed us that we've seen successful logins into our environment, and we've certainly seen that recon. We needed to now identify, well, where has that persistence and lateral movement been? And so we ended off on that device logins hunt. So that's where we're going to start again. And I'm going to bring that hunt back up, and we'll kind of review what's in there, and then we will continue to go through and look for additional indicators of activity. Now, before we get in there, let's take a look at this bottom section here under the target. It's in that little target bubble, because one of the things we're going to want to look for is some of these particular tactics and techniques. Now, in this case, what we're going to look for is the C2 tunneling. It's shown down on the report here is the Eagle tunneling tool. So if you go through that report that I referenced earlier, one of the mechanisms of maintaining both persistence but also maintaining control was for the attacker, in this case Peach Sandstorm, to get access to an endpoint with an elevated permission and then drop in effectively a reverse shell tool, so an outbound proxy, if you would, going to a command and control server. So that is what we're going to look for. We're going to start to look for to see which devices were impacted, because again, we still don't know that as of yet. Which devices were impacted on that device, what activity actually happened. So do we see any type of activity being launched on that endpoint, and then do we see evidence of an outbound tunnel? Okay, so that's what we're going to be looking for as we hunt. So I'm just going to very quickly now switch over to our platform here, and we're going to start again. This is that analytics report. Just to reference it again, if you guys wanted to look for this stuff yourself and try it, it is the activity profile Peach Sandstorm password spray targets. So that is the name of the report. It's got all the details in it that we reviewed last time, including details around each one of these phases. Of course, we already reviewed phase 1, phase 2, and we didn't do phase 3. I will tell you quite frankly, phase 3, when it talks about the Eagle tunneling, in this particular report, it's just a blurb. You got to do a little bit more research. But again, it is that outbound channel that we're looking for. Okay, so where we kind of left off last time was we finished doing the Azure Hound hunt, and then we went back to this identity logon events authorizations hunt that we created to find evidence of logins to a desktop. And lo and behold, we actually found one. You can see it highlighted there just in that top line there. We can see it's a Windows login. It's coming from that which we now know from the previous hunts is a malicious IP, specifically for this compromised account. Now, last time we did get as far as just very quickly taking a look at device login attempts, okay? And what I'm going to call out here is that there's a little bit of a change that we've had to make in the query. And the reason being is as an attacker comes into our environment, okay, they're not always going to come from the same malicious IP. In fact, quite often they're going to rotate that because that is indicative of malicious behavior. When you see a lot of login attempts and then a successful login from from an IP, it tells systems and people that IP happens to be malicious. So attackers are often going to obfuscate or rotate the IPs. And so we know IP, while it certainly is something that we can look for, really what we want to look at is the actual event. So we're going to use a time frame instead, a short window time frame, so that we can correlate the activity we're seeing here from a desktop login, which the actual device login events, and that's covered within the device login events table. And again, this is a defender table that we're querying here. Now, we ran this last time, but I am going to run it again just to show you what comes back, okay? What we are looking at here, if we take a look at any one of these logons, okay, and I've shrunk this down a little bit here so that you can see it, but we actually do have a successful login. But notice that the IP is a different IP than what we saw previously. Right, so the IP previously that we saw, and I'm just going to go back to that hunt here, and we can bring it up, was 192.34.82.254. So a different IP, but this is only the only login activity that we can actually correlate against the time frame that we're looking at here. We can see that the time frame here, the last activity there was 12:51:46. When we pivot over and we extend the time range to go from 12:51 to 12:55, the only login events that we actually see on the device from the device log is coming from a different IP. Now, one of the nice things about the Defender platform is if you wanted to get information on that IP while you're hunting right away and do some sort of correlation, you can do that simply by actually clicking on the IP. So when I click on that IP, which is an entity that's called up, I'm actually pulling up information that Microsoft already has on this particular IP. Okay. Now, in this case, it's not going to be flagged as a malicious IP. Now, I'll tell you honestly, guys, most of the time a Defender is not going to use a known malicious IP because they are rotating it. But quite often, if it is malicious and it came from a known Tor site, for example, or a known malicious IP, that's going to be identified here as well. In this case, it's not. This is actually a clean IP because, of course, it's something that we simulated. But you can get the IP details. And again, you're right from this hunt here, guys, where you can actually see the organization that owns it, its ASN, the ISP, I should say, the country it belongs to, where it's located, its latitude, longitude, its postcode. So all that information from a geo. And again, I'm just going to highlight if it was malicious, you would actually see some of that indications. You'll also be able to see whether or not you've seen this IP any time before. And in this case, we do have some activity. We've done some hunting bookmarks. Now that's something we'll show you kind of a little bit later on, but you're getting that automatic correlation, which is a really, really handy thing. Now, if we pivot over to the device logons hunt, it is a different IP, but when I click on that IP, you're going to notice some similarities. Similarity number one is that it's owned by the same ISP, it's the same ASN, it's actually located in the same city. You're also going to see, if you go back and forth between the two, that the dates, the first scene and the last scene, occur around a similar time. Okay, now in this case, there is the data source is only coming from security alert rather than from that hunt, right? But you're able to see all of this information kind of right there and there. So this allows you to then say, okay, I've got activity that's correlated based on time, and there's definitely some similarities between the IPs. And I happen to know that the account that's being used to log on is compromised because we saw that before. So really good information right at hand that you can leverage as we kind of go forward, because now we know that this is likely going to be a malicious IP. Moreover, we've gathered information actually on the device. So in this previous hunt, we only knew that it was a Windows desktop that was compromised. We didn't know which one. But by leveraging the device logon events table and that very narrow time window for the compromised account that we knew about, we're able to very rapidly identify the device. And very much in the same way, if we wanted to, we can click right now within this hunt and get details on that specific device. It'll take a couple minutes to load here. But we can now we have information that's really handy for us, right? We know that this is an Azure AD joined device. So if it's an Azure AD joined device, it means it is registered within our Active Directory. Or sorry, it's not registered, I should say, in our Active Directory. It's actually joined specifically to Azure. So this is a good indication that this is a device that is like a virtual machine, for example, that happens to be in Azure. Okay. We also have information around its IP address. We can see whether or not it's onboarded and all kind of fun stuff. We can see if there's valid users on there, if there's any advanced classification, if we have any DLP rules and there were DLP hits, we would see them in here. We can also see its configuration status in terms of whether or not it would be configured for real-time monitoring or behavioral monitoring. If we've got in-tune policies as well, so we were doing compliance policies, we could see all that stuff as well, which is really, really handy. So again, you don't need to now go hunt for that even further. You can just start here and get information about the device. And if you wanted to, you could take actions right here, right? So I've done this hunt now, I've identified this device, and maybe that's enough for me. I'm going to lock this device down. So you can go here and you can immediately isolate the device, or you can initiate a live response, or you can initiate an automated investigation. So you could stop here and start your investigation and flag this as an incident. Of course, we're not going to, because the whole point of today's webinar is to continue that hunt, and that's what we're going to do next. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this machine and we're going to pivot down now and start looking for inbound connections. So we know that there was a successful login. We know now there was a different IP address. There was a different IP address that was used to do that login. We want to see what kind of logon it is. And the way we're going to do that is to identify what are those inbound connections to the machine. And to do that, we're going to query the device and network events. Now, again, we are going to use a time range to help correlate this. Okay, so it's really to shrink the window that we're looking at, because we know when that login activity happened, and we certainly don't want to have a query that's going back 30 days and just takes forever to chug. So we're going to narrow that time window, leveraging those start and end dates, or times, I should say. Okay, we know the device ID. Again, that's pulled back from our other hunt. We know the device name, but we also know it's the device ID. And so what in that successive hunt, that's what I'm actually using as opposed to using the device name. We're using that specific device ID. Okay. Sorry, my sharing window is just covering my ability. And there we go. Oh, we did it again. Just hang on one sec there, guys. I know you can't see it on your screen. There we go. Okay, so we're also going to use that remote IP, right? So now that's that new malicious IP or highly suspicious IP. We're also looking specifically for the action type inbound connection accepted. We want to identify what type of connection this actually was, okay? Now, we run this query. It's brought back some additional information, okay? First and foremost, right? Because we know, and I've just returned it here in the results, I didn't filter them out, but again, we know the device name, we know that this was a successful connection and it's coming from that IP address. We also have some information obviously on the local IP address, which is really, really handy. But what I want you to pay attention to is the port. In this particular case, it's 3389, right? And 3389 is RDP. So what we know now from running this hunt is that we have a successful login, because we've seen that login and that inbound connection, a connection that has been accepted, okay, over port 3389, meaning somebody has interactively logged on to the device, okay? And that becomes really important. Like at this point, guys, we know somebody either has been or is currently in our environment. This is also very indicative of human operated malware, right? Because now you can see that somebody is in the environment. The next logical step is to see, well, what is it that they did? What kind of damage did they do? Did they establish persistence? Are they communicating out? All that kind of fun stuff. There's a whole bunch of other details here that you can take a look at, okay? But one thing I do want to point out, and I'm going to call this out a couple times, is we can certainly see, in this particular case, the token elevation type is default, meaning at this point, the user, this particular logon process was not an elevated process. And I'm calling that out because what you're going to see in the next hunt is where that changes, okay?
David, do you mind if I jump in here quickly for a
Please
second?
do.
And for those of you who weren't able to join us on our first session, my name is Mitch Kelsey. I'm the national SOC leader here at CDW. What I think is important about this step of the kill chain with interactive logon is it also starts to expand our scope, as you mentioned, that there's likely a human involved here. And we have to look both at the technical pieces of data that we're going to have for the hunting, but also what other baseline information we need to understand about the impacted devices, because this is those opportunities that if there are blind spots in our coverage, that they might be able to sneakily modify access to something or use existing behaviors of legitimate tools to be able to further their efforts. And so establishing this as part of our scope at this point will help us know and make sure we cover off our bases to make sure that we well understand what they may have modified or accessed.
Thank you, Mitch. That's great context. One other thing I want to point out before we pivot to the next hunt, and I'm actually going to go back to the threat report again and just take a look at that graphic. But before I do, I want you to take a look at local IP type and remote IP type, okay? What we can see here is obviously somebody is coming from a public IP address into the private, okay? And that is pretty concerning. But if we'd already done this hunt and we knew that somebody was in our environment and we saw private to private, now that's somebody moving laterally through the environment. And that should raise all kinds of red flags. I mean, we've already got red flags raised. We know somebody is logged in at least to a machine in our environment remotely. But if we saw other logon events within the same time frame, or maybe now we want to extend that time frame a little further to look for more login events by the compromised account, and maybe not looking at that remote IP, but just looking for inbound connections, if we see private to private, that's lateral movement. And that's a big problem. Okay, so it's what's really handy about what's being returned here. Most folks may be able to just look at the remote IP, for example, and go, oh, well, that's a public address or that's a private address. I have a problem, or I have a bigger problem. But the fact that you can just very quickly look and see, oh, okay, I've got a private to private, or I've got a public to private, is really good information to quickly pivot. And again, if you see private to private, like you're in breach territory, and now it's time to bring everybody to the table to figure out what's going on. Fortunately, in this case, that's not what we're going to do. Okay, I'm going to move to the next hunt here. So I'm just going to pivot quickly. I'm actually to try to make this a little bit easier because of the sharing screen. I'm just going to move this down just a titch. There we go. Okay. So this next query is a bit of a complex query. I'm going to explain what we're doing and why. Okay, and then we'll talk about the results. So what we're doing here is now we're going to join two tables, because we knew from device network events previously that we saw inbound connections. But if I go back to the threat analytics profile, the activity profile, right? The activity we're really interested in is either lateral movements. And again, we saw public to private, so we haven't seen evidence of that yet. Okay, and we're not going to look for that today, but we could. Or we could look for the execution and persistence, or we could look for C2 tunneling. Right, so outbound C2 connections. And that's what we're going to look for here. Okay, so we're leveraging, again, this report to say, okay, what makes the most sense to look for next? Now, there are a ton of different ways and queries that you can write to try to bubble this stuff up. Okay, and so what you're going to see here is an example of the type of query you're going to want to run to hunt for this stuff. But I'll tell you honestly, looking for outbound C2 connections is often going to require multiple different queries and multiple different data sources. So data sources from, maybe if it's internal, from your firewall, if it's in the cloud, from your cloud firewall. If you happen to be running a third-party DNS security tool, you may want to look at things like NetFlow traffic, all that kind of fun stuff to identify and bubble up that C2 communication. In this case, however, we're simplifying it a little bit, although the query is not exactly simple. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to combine two things. Okay, we're going to look for device events, network events, I should say, that again are within that time window that we saw. We saw an inbound connection, and now we're looking for an outbound connection very quickly. Now, I'm going to call this out as well. You're not always going to see that. Sometimes somebody's going to be on the device for a long time. Okay, and then they're going to have outbound connections. So time is maybe not as valuable here, but is a good place to start, especially if it's an automated process. It's a piece of malware that's establishing these connections. Generally speaking, it's going to happen in relatively short order, as opposed to somebody who's actually physically, or I should say in this case, remotely logged on to the device and then doing some nefarious things. But we're still, in this particular case, going to use that time, start and end time, to sort of narrow the query results. We're also going to look at the device IDs. Now, in this case, I'm using an in clause, and I've just repeated the device ID. But if you had multiple devices, what we talked about before, where you saw some lateral movement, using that in clause is going to include them in results, which is really great. Okay, we want to make sure that we're not returning results in this particular query that are private IP addresses, because again, we are specifically looking at that public connectivity inbound. Now, if you had that lateral movement, you can wipe out that statement, because now you want to look at that lateral movement. So you want to return results that where there are the remote IP. So and in that case, we're not talking necessarily outside the organization, but really the source IP is probably a better way of saying it. Is not inside the network. But again, if you're looking for that internal lateral traffic, you want that. Okay, so we've got that. That's the information we're trying to return, because we want to find all those events. But we also now want to find information around the processes behind those events, because that's going to help to filter that query. So a couple of things that we're using here: same start and end time, same device ID. But now we're also looking at initiating process signature status. Yes, it's true, signed processes can be used in nefarious ways, but often it's not. Often it's unsigned processes that we are concerned about. And so to help filter and bubble up actual malicious activity, that's what we're going to look for. Okay, now we're joining these results together so that we can see all of this data. Now, what I've done, just in the interest of speed, is I've projected And that's a way, by the way, of just bringing in and displaying only certain columns in a query. That's what we've done here just to facilitate the conversation and make it a little bit more streamlined. Otherwise, we'd run out of time. But there's a ton of information that this specific query will bring back, which is actually very cool, but no time to go into it today. But what do we see from these results? Okay, and there's a result here that I'm just going to highlight just to give you guys an example of the stuff that we're seeing. Okay, on that device name from a different or out to, because this is an outbound connection, remember, we're seeing outbound communication to this particular IP address. It's going over a non-standard port, not necessarily indicative of malicious behavior, not indicative of malicious behavior either. However, there's a couple other pieces here that we're seeing. Okay, number one, we're seeing that the initiating parent process is PowerShell. Okay, PowerShell has launched this next executable, which conveniently in this case is named remote shell, but often is going to be named something different. Okay, and that it was done with fully elevated privileges, and that is very indicative of a malicious actor now creating elevated processes to do something. Okay, and if you look at that very next line, the initiating process command, we can see this reverse shell is making an outbound connection over port 8888, so 4 8s, to that IP address. That is C2 traffic, or at least it's indicative of C2 traffic. So now we've gone and we have confirmed all the way from the start of the password spray attack, going back to threat analytics here, we've confirmed this full chain. Password spray to login, to recon, to a remote login onto a device, which happened to be RDP, an elevated PowerShell that launched a process to communicate to a C2 server. Now, if you've run this hunt, this is what you found, you absolutely have a problem, and now it's time to start launching an investigation. And again, as we called out before, at any point along the line when you're doing these hunts, if you wanted to start an investigation on an IP address or on a device like I previously showed you, and I'll actually just do that very quickly again. I'm just going to move this down again so I can quickly pivot to it. Again, I can very quickly come into this device where now I know I have a problem, okay? And I can start doing things like doing a live response, right? Or would be if they were still connected, I could terminate this connection out to the CC server if I wanted to, or I could isolate the device, or I could start an automated investigation and collect an investigation package. So I've got all the information ready for the investigators if I'm in full breach. Hunt to full incident. So this, guys, is how Defender and Sentinel can be leveraged, bringing in the data from multiple different tables. And again, I encourage you to use both Defender and Sentinel because, as you've seen in this process, a lot of the hunts use multiple tables to start. And threat analytics. This is something that comes for free with Defender to start informing how you hunt. Again, this is more tactical. Absolutely, you're not going to become a full threat hunter by walking through the process we walk through here, but threat analytics is a great place to start. And if you can start thinking about those chains of activities, and you can leverage MITRE for that, which is really handy to see how those activities are used, you can start to then hunt for it.
Worth mentioning as well, to remind what Brian said last time, is even for those on the line who might have experienced threat hunting, how much time this saves having all of this correlated into one platform versus historically having to take this from a number of different source systems, possibly that aren't normalized, and having to stitch together this on a manual basis. This integrated platform allows you to do it a lot more quickly, even if you have the skill set to do it manually.
Thank you, Mitch. Okay, we've got 25 minutes. We still have a lot to get to, so I'm going to go a little bit faster if I can, because the last thing, the playbook, is going to take some time to go through. So let's start talking about the options you have available to you to automate the hunting process. Let's quickly go back to our hunts here. And I'm going to grab a relatively simplistic hunt. I will use the identity login events as an example. Okay. Now, in this case, I'm using a project statement. I'm going to talk about that in a second because it's going to be relevant. But let's say you've done this hunt and you haven't found anything, right? But you don't want to necessarily do this, log in and do this hunt every 7 days. You want something that's going to look back in time and do it for you. And the way in which you can do that is either with Defender custom detection rules or with Sentinel analytic rules. Okay. Now we'll review the custom detections for Defender XDR first. Now you'll see here it's grayed out, but you're also going to see why it's grayed out. And I really wanted to call this out, right? I'm not returning all of the queries. And there's one thing in particular in order to generate instance that Defender requires, and it's the report ID, because I'm using that project statement. But if I wipe that project statement out, okay, and I come back in here, you'll see as it'll sit and think, and now I can create a custom detection rule, or I can create a log analytics rule. But in this case, we're going to stick with the custom detection rule. I will walk through that custom analytics or that log analytics rule in just a second. So we're going to go in and we're just going to very quickly put this rule together. I'm just going to give it some fictitious names. I'm going to call this one identity. Actually, I'll just call it password spray just for fun. And I'm going to put gobbledygook in for the rest of it just because otherwise it would take me too long to type. We're going to run this particular hunt every 3 hours, but you can make it every 24 hours. Actually, I'll set it to every 24 hours. I'm just going to give it a title. Okay, I can select the severity. So when we went and did the password spray before, we had said, okay, well, this is indicative of, hey, it looks like somebody's actually done some login. So I'm going to set this one to high. Okay, I can actually link it to that threat analytics report, which means if I see this in the future, it's going to tie back to that. So I'll just quickly do Peach Sandstorm here, if I could actually type properly. And we'll say the password sprays. That was the activity profile that we were looking at. I'm not going to give it an actual description. I think that description is fine, and no recommended actions, but you can absolutely populate those. Oh, I guess I have to put something in, don't I? I'll just put gobbledygook in for now. And I do need to give a category. Go ahead.
While you're doing that, David, it's worth noting that this is such an important point, because if we've learned those lessons and we've done this well as part of the hunt, we want to standardize the way that we're doing this every other time that alert fires. So it's great to be able to take this effort that we've just ran through and standardize it so that every time an analyst sees it, they know what to do with those next steps.
Thank you, Mitch. Okay, we're going to move to the next steps here. Now that I've identified the category, which is credential access, we can now also start to do things that we couldn't do before in our hunts, and that's map entities. So remember I said, let's keep track of those things, those attack components. We can do that here, right? So I can say, okay, for this particular query, I want to map device name to device, and maybe I want to map the user, in this particular case, to the account UPN. So those will be identified as entities going forward, which is going to make it easier to either run investigations or investigation packages or even do successive hunts. We can also take automated actions. Okay, so based off of detections, we can do certain things depending on the type of query. Now, in this case, I'm not on a device yet, right? If I was on the device login events, I could isolate the device or I could collect an investigation package. I'm not returning anything here that's relevant, but I am returning users. So I can force a password reset based on the account SID, or I can disable the user. Right? Or I can mark them as compromised. And if I do that, and I'm using Azure ADP2 with risk-based conditional access, all those automated processes will happen, either forcing the MFA or forcing the password reset. Okay. And I'll just do that here. And then I'm just going to kind of click through and submit. This will now be registered in custom detections. Okay. So if I click on custom detections here, for example, we are actually going to see that in here now. Okay, and we can see it's actually running right now, so it ran right away, and it will run every 24 hours. Now, there's another option to you, and again, I will highlight custom detection rules are for Defender tables only. Okay, but we have run some queries that go beyond just a Defender table, right? And so you can leverage those queries in an analytic rule. Now, I'm not going to go and bring that query back up in the interest of time, but I do want to kind of highlight it here. So let's say we wanted to run this as an analytics rule in Sentinel, and it was a little bit more of a complex query where we're bringing maybe some firewall events or some security events from our servers, whatever the case may be. Same kind of process, right? I can give it a name. I'm just going to call it password spray hunt again. I'm going to set its severity. Again, I'm going to again choose credential access. In this case, I'm just going to look for, we'll just search for password spray. I'll use brute force for now because I think password spray is under that. Yeah, it is. Okay, perfect. Okay. And this is where I can use the rule logic. Now, interestingly enough, I didn't need to write the rule logic. It automatically came in. Okay, now you're seeing a bit of a flag there. It's going to take some time. It's going to validate that query for you, which is really handy. The same sort of thing that we did with the Defender rule, we can also do with Sentinel. So we can do entity mapping, and I can say, okay, let's say in this case, I know I'm pulling back an IP address. I can map that IP address to something that's returned by the query. In this case, it should be, I think it's remote IP if I'm not mistaken, right? So I can do that mapping. Same with the device. If I wanted to take a look at, say, the device ID, we'll call it host, and this one we're going to call it the, where is it here? Full name, and we want it to map to the device name. Okay. Again, it's going to keep track of these entities. And then if you've looked at our previous webinars, you'll see how those entities can be really handy because you can run playbooks directly against those entities, or you can expand your investigation with the investigation map. And again, if you want to look at that, what that looks like, go to one of our other webinars that are available on our YouTube channel. You could also add any custom details, so key value pairs that maybe you want to keep track of that maybe aren't entities, but things that you care about. So I don't know, maybe you care about the additional fields that are returned in the query. You can do those as well. You can also specify and name the alert based off of some of the stuff that comes back. So some of your entities. So if I wanted to, I could put something in here that says hosts was communicated to by IP address. And these are fields that are available from the entity mapping. I'm not going to do that in this case, but it gives you that ability. You can also set the query schedule. So how far back it's going to look and how often it's going to run, or if you want it to run automatically. And you can set, in this instance, alert thresholds. Maybe we don't care about 1. Maybe when it hits 10 or 12, now it's a real issue. And then we can also do entity grouping, right? Or not entity grouping, sorry, instant grouping. Do we want all the alerts under one instant over a particular period of time, or do we want to trigger an alert for every single incident? Okay. We can also adjust, and I'm not going to save this one, so don't worry about the X's there. We can also adjust the instance settings. So we can create them obviously automatically, but we can also do alert grouping into the instance themselves, okay, and change how far back we want to consider all the alerts of the same type as part of the same incident. We can even reopen an instance that we've previously closed. And we can also do automated response. Now, in this case, there is an automation. I can create another one that's going to actually run a playbook. So maybe, again, we wanted this to automatically isolate a device. And from the Sentinel perspective, the way in which you would do that is with a playbook. You write a playbook to actually build that logic out to do that isolation and do a whole bunch of really cool things. Okay.
I really like that example that you shared a second ago, David, of being able to reopen closed incidents, because you may have lower severity activity that's happening that your analysts are not going to be proceeding with, because in and of itself, it's not a high risk activity. But without adding noise to their triage efforts, this allows them to then reprioritize them when they become more serious, because this additional information has been stitched together.
Beautiful context. Thank you, Mitch. Okay. We're going to very quickly talk about hunts, which is a Sentinel capability, okay? So we're going to go down into this Sentinel area, okay? And we're actually going to look under threat management for hunting. There's lots of documentation on hunts. I'm going to go quickly on this, and I'm not going to talk about live stream at all today. I will talk a little bit about bookmarks and queries, obviously, because they are part of it. But let's talk about what a hunt is. A hunt is a way of collecting a bunch of queries together, not necessarily to automatically run them, but to very quickly run them and see changes over time. The nice thing is as you run these queries, and these are these same queries that we saw previously, they've simply been saved and now added to this particular hunt. So for example, our initial password spray attack or the Azure AD authentications from a particular IP. Now, in this case, I'm setting a specific time. Typically, just so you're aware, what you should be doing is wiping out that time and letting it actually be set within the query itself. Otherwise, you won't see the delta between each query result coming back, okay? But if we take one of these and we decide to run that hunt, and I am going to set it to I think I might actually pivot to Sentinel for this. I will. Keeping in mind Sentinel and Defender, that merging of the two platforms into one is still in preview. So some things are still easier, not better, but easier to run within the Sentinel environment there. What we can do is we can actually set the time frame for which we want to run these queries, and we can run them. You will be able to see changes over time. But what we'll also be able to see is entities, right? So if I ran this query, for example, right now, and I wanted to view the results, and we'll just let it come back. It's the last 24 hours, so we're going to go back. Let's go back a couple of weeks just for fun here. That one is not actually returning anything. Let's go back to the hunt. Maybe it was the other one. Just give it a second to think, because obviously we've successfully run this before. Let's just do a refresh on that. I've had this open for a while. All right, let's come back here. You can see that's actually running right now. So it's just running, and now in this instance, it hasn't returned a result. But what we can see is that we've already registered some bookmarks against this from that password spray attack that was run previously. Okay, and when we configured this hunt, we did some entity mapping. So we've actually tracked some of those entities along the way as each one of these hunts have been run. Now, again, this is not fully automated in any way, shape, or form. You do need to come in and you do need to run these. But what it does is allows you to register a series of chained queries together so that you can run them very quickly in succession and see them evolve over time. Now, one of the downsides of this approach right now is that you can't take entities from one query and have them automatically injected into another query, right? So, for example, if we added the Azure, or actually this is a good example, if we wanted to do this interactive, non-interactive logons where we took this IP, and in this case I've actually edited it in there. Now ideally you'd be able to, anything that's returned from the initial password spray attack, if it comes back with that entity, and we can see that entity here, it would be automatically injected into the next hunt. It doesn't do that yet, although apparently that is on the roadmap. But there is a way of doing that, and that is to actually use Sentinel playbooks. So that is what we've done. We have actually built a playbook specifically for this Peach Sandstorm attack to go through all of these hunts that we have just done in a very automated fashion. I'm going to quickly pivot back to the presentation because it's easier to see if we come back to the designer here for the Logic app, which is the basis for playbooks within Sentinel. It's long, it's not laid out very well, and it's not supposed to be. It's designed for when you're actually designing. But I wanted to encapsulate what that logic looks like, so I just very quickly put together this flow diagram so you guys could see what the process is. And we're going to run this in real time so you can see how it works. Okay. So when we first run this hunt, okay, or run this playbook, it's going to launch that initial password spray hunt. If there are results found, it's going to update the incident to low and proceed to the next hunt. Okay, and if not, it's just going to end the hunt right there, and you'll see the status messages come across. It's also going to take those attack components, those entities, in this case, the IP address from the run password hunt, and it's going to inject it into that next hunt automatically. And then that hunt is going to run. And then based off the results, the hunt is either going to end or the status of the incident is going to be updated to medium. And when I say status of the incident, what I will show you is that you have to create an incident first in Sentinel and then run a hunt, but it's actually valuable to do that. And I'll show you why in a second. Okay. Again, it's going to take information from that interactive hunt. In this particular case, it's going to be a combination of the IP address and the compromised user account, which was that Bob account, and it's going to inject it into the Azure Hound hunt, and that's going to run. And then based off of its results, again, either end the result or update that status. It says medium. That should say high, so that's a typo on my part. We're going to update that status to medium. We're going to take the information we found from the Azure hunt, in this case, the time range. We're going to extend it a little, and we're going to inject that into the next hunt. And then based off of the results, we're going to take the indicators from that hunt and inject them into the next hunt, and so on, right till we get to the end. That is what this playbook does. And it's going to actually update these results within the Sentinel incident. And that's the important piece. And I'll give you an example of that. So I'll just look at the one that I did just a couple of hours ago, just so you can see what this is going to look like. Okay. But if we look at the activity log here, This is where all the comments and the instance and the notification, all the data that we want is going to be registered. Okay. Now there's other things that you can do here as well. We could actually add bookmarks by leveraging the automation to add the results from what we found from the queries into bookmarks. In this case, we haven't done that, but that is absolutely something you can do. You can also use the playbook to communicate out maybe via Teams to your security operations team and actually ask for other input, like, do you want to continue with this hunt, or would you like to choose a different playbook to run? So there are things that you can do there as well. So this is a little bit of a simplified hunting playbook. But as you can see, as we go through, we are collecting data each and every single time we run, a stage of that playbook is run. And you can see where the status was changed. You can see where the severity was changed based off of the results that came back. Now, in order to do this, and actually in order to run a playbook, unless you just wanted to go to playbooks and just hit run, in order to run a playbook and track it in a way where you can update and provide those comments, you need to create an instant first. So that's what we're going to do. We'll just quickly go in here and we'll create an instant. We'll call it, I don't know, webinar H Sandstorm. Forgive my bad typing. Okay, we're going to set the initial status to informational. Okay. We're going to go ahead and we're going to create that. That is going to create an instant. And I just don't want to look for. I want to look at all severities there. So I'm just going to click quick refresh so I can get this back up. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to go into that into that incident, currently severity informational. Okay. No information is available to us at this time. This is just an empty incident. But what we are going to do is we are going to run that playbook. Okay. Now, this is going to bring up the list of all the playbooks that we can run, and there's a whole bunch that you have available. They're out of box. They can be custom developed. We develop them for customers as well. We're in this case going to look for that Peach Sandstorm hunt, okay? And now we're going to run it. So now this is launching that process that we saw, and I'm just going to bring up the activity log, okay? And I'm going to keep refreshing this so you can see this over time, how this hunting is being done, right? It's each one of these successful activities, or I should say successive activities. And of course, if they're successful, we're getting back the information that we've stipulated in the hunt and moving on to that next stage. So we are doing this in a fully automated way. Okay, you can see I can keep refreshing. You can see now that we got the results from the Azure Hound Hunt. I'm just going to keep refreshing so you can see this happen in real time. By the way, you don't have to keep refreshing. If you come in here, it's going to tell you that there's new results. Just a little aside there, right? So now we can see the device logins hunt, all that same information that we looked at, guys, before in terms of what we're pulling back, right? We can see the device name. We can see that's a remote interactive. I'm going to refresh it again. We should see the successive hunts after that. So scroll down a little bit so you can see. So again, now we're also looking for those inbound connections, right? And we can see that there. We've got a pretty significant issue that we need to deal with. We talked about that before, all that data. And if you remember correct from when we did the hunt before, I used the project statement to shrink this down. Well, in this particular instance, I'm not using the project statement. I want to bring back all of the details from these connections, these inbound connections. Then, of course, we can see that outbound connection, okay? And so you can see here all those outbound connections from the device IDs that we spoke about, right? Or device IDs, sorry, process IDs. You can see the call, the port. You can keep scrolling down to see the actual process itself and what that command line was. So now we have everything here in this automated hunt. What's great is now we already have an incident. And what you'll notice over off the side, now we started this hunt, this automated hunt, as a informational level incident, and it was elevated over time, and now it's sitting as a high incident, which means now you can start to go in and you can do start to do some of your investigation. Okay, now there are some limitations with the playbooks right now that I'm going to call out. Okay, one of those is that you can't currently register entities. So it's a bit of a limitation that currently exists. The API is constantly being updated, and it's the Sentinel API that's being leveraged to within these queries to update the incident and to map things together. So that's something you can't currently do today. Now, a workaround for that you could do is in this activity log for the hunt, you could actually have the hunting statement itself. So that query shown here in the incident log, and you could come in and then go to logs and run that exact same query, and you're going to pull back information, and that'll allow you to map entities. You have to do it manually, or to register bookmarks. Okay. Now, of course, we didn't do this in this particular case, but that is a potential workaround. You can register bookmarks leveraging Sentinel today. It is actually something that's supported within playbooks. What I will tell you is it is in preview, and it doesn't necessarily work the best. But again, the workaround is the one that I just kind of spoke about, where you can come in, you can any hunt that you're automating, have that query statement with which will be, by the way, fully populated, right? So in terms of like the entities that you're looking for. You don't need to go and hunt for, forgive the term, but hunt and look for those and find them. They're just going to be automatically populated into that query statement. If you structured your playbook correctly, you can simply echo them out within the activity log and then run them here. And then once you've got those bookmarks, then you can start to expand your investigate. Now, you'll see this down here, right? The investigate button is grayed out, and that is because you need entities in order to investigate. Okay, but if you've identified something leveraging the query in logs and now you flag that as an entity, now you can start to pivot. Okay, and you can start to hunt a little bit differently. An example of that, I'll just maybe I'll just quickly go back just to give you guys a view of what that might look like. If I go into the full details here, just give it a second. Like this is what the investigation graph will look like, right? And you see it's it's kind of all over the place. Like there's a lot of stuff here, but you can expand your hunt overall just by taking a look and highlighting over some of these flags here to see, well, in case I can't, let's take a look at the user, for example, right? So this is another way that you can hunt. It's not automated. And again, if you've got those entities and you've done this hunt, you can now start to pivot a little bit, right? You can look for related events or related alerts, I should say, any office activity for IP address, and you can just quickly click in and it's going to run those queries. Again, these are like hunting queries, and then you can add those bookmarks and add them into the investigation. Everything pivoting from this automated hunt, okay? Now, the other limitation I will tell you, okay, is if you are doing a one-time hunt, like it's just something like, oh, you know what, I want to do this hunt because I've got this new threat report, and it's not something that you're going to do repeatedly, building a playbook doesn't make a lot of sense because it does take time to run that hunt, okay? Now, you're going to save a ton of time. To build that hunt, I should say. You're going to save a ton of time running that hunt for sure. Because, I mean, it took us, an hour, and I obviously had all these queries lined up, but it took us the better part of an hour over 2 webinars to do this hunt, and we just saw the playbook do it in seconds. So you're going to save time that way. But to build out the playbooks does take time. You're probably looking at, if you know what you're doing, probably 2 to 3 hours to build a playbook out, assuming that you've got all those hunting statements. So if it's a one-time thing, playbooks is not something you want to use, okay? Use the custom detection rules, use the custom analytic rules, heck, even use the hunts if you want to, okay? But if it's something you are going to do repeatedly, okay, something you're going to look for repeatedly, building a playbook to automate that hunting process is going to save you just a ton of time. Okay. We have 2 more minutes here. I do want to just highlight from CDW. I know some of the stuff that we've talked about here is quite complex. It might take some time to wrap your heads around. And guys, we're here to help if you need the help. Okay, so we have full deployment services that are available, so we can come in and help build out playbooks or help stand up your Sentinel or Defender instance. We also have a rapid deployment if you just want to get up and running really quickly with Defender, XDR, or Sentinel. We offer funded engagements, so Microsoft will fund CDW to come in and do build out a temporary environment, but in your production environment, so you can get a real good understanding of what the experience to use Sentinel and use Defender XDR collectively together. They will pay us to come in and do that for you, which gets you part of the way there to a deployment, if I'm being honest. And then last but not least, we also offer a full suite of managed services, including MDR for Defender XDR, managed detection and response for Defender XDR, and managed detection and response for Sentinel. So if you guys need any assistance there in any way, shape, or form, please feel free to reach out to CDW. And with that, we have come to the conclusion of this 2-part webinar series. Folks, I hope you've enjoyed the webinar series. If you have, please send us your feedback and let us know. If there's something we didn't cover or maybe a topic that you would like to see in the future, we plan on holding these webinars at least once every couple of months, possibly even monthly. So, send us your feedback. Let us know what you want to see. It doesn't necessarily need to be on Sentinel or Defender. It can be on Purview. It can be on Entra ID. Let us know. We'll definitely put those webinars together and invite you to them, and we'll go from there. So thank you everybody much for your time. Have a great day.